It is the voice of Indiana County, WCCS 101.1 FM and AM 1160. And our conversation this morning with Winifred Gallagher is brought to you by Marcus & Mack, a law firm representing injured people. The book is called New Women in the Old West, From Settlers to Suffragists, an Untold American Story. Winifred, good morning.
I'm delighted to be with you.
I'm glad you're able to be with us here today because I have to ask you this. As I read through the book and got further into it, I thought, how did she come across this story? What made you want to write this story?
Actually, living half-time in Wyoming, I became very impressed by the versatile women who pretty much ran local affairs, starting with the 80-year-old mayor. And that's not even counting the actual cowgirls. I found out that these women were carrying on a long tradition of achievement and independence and civic involvement that was rooted in the Old West era of the mid-19th to early 20th centuries. And contrary to the myth of the men who settled the West, women were equally essential to developing that vast territory beyond the Mississippi.
What we learned very quickly from your book is that while it was such a daunting thing to go into what would be termed in the day untamed territory, with all of the dangers and hardships that it would bring, there was opportunity there in the West that was not available in the more developed areas in the East.
That's right. There were some real advantages for women, starting with statistics. White men significantly outnumbered white women in the West, particularly in the mining towns, which made women and their work much more valued. One of my favorite stories is the wife who was making breakfast for her husband one morning in Gold Rush, California, when a miner walked by and offered her $5 for a hot breakfast. That's about $168 in today's money. And she noted that he would have paid her $10 if she had asked. So in that kind of environment, women had their pick of suitors, and unhappy wives soon liberated themselves from unsatisfactory husbands. In America's first divorce mills, California was very quickly the number one divorce state in the nation. Women also benefited from life in the West's much simpler, more experimental settler society. Every pair of hands was needed to get all the work done, whether it was allegedly man's work or woman's work. No one had time to care about that. And that kind of flexibility enabled women to become more equal by acting more like equals. As in most of America today, it took two economic providers to support a family. In the new communities rising up from scratch, it was often town mothers rather than town fathers who organized the first schools and churches and charities. These hardworking women were not yet considered equal to men, but they really narrowed that gap, and they won respect as a force to be reckoned with.
And this is where the idea of women's suffrage really began to take hold in America. They've been fighting for it in the East for a long time. Here, almost out of necessity, but certainly out of the opportunity aspect of it, women found that suffrage was something that was not only worthy of being pursued, but possible for the first time.
Yeah, it's remarkable. As you point out, the suffrage movement was based, the national movement was based in the East and essentially in New York and Boston, but it caught fire in the West. I think there are several reasons for that. Compared to men in the South and East, Western men had witnessed women's contributions to settlement, and they were impressed by that women's achievements, and they were just notably more open to the idea of giving them more rights. The male legislators also were self-interested, that they wanted more voters, period, but especially women voters in places like, say, Wyoming, where white men outnumbered white women 9-1. Passing controversial laws was also much easier in the loosely governed territories, which had to address women's legal rights and political status because they had to write new constitutions, so they were forced to debate the question. So for all these reasons, in 1869, the Wyoming Territory's women became the first in European American history to be fully enfranchised. followed just 1 year later by women in the largely Mormon Utah territory. And so both of those territories enfranchised women a full half century before the 19th Amendment, which was passed in 1920. So it irritates me. It's often said that Western men gave women the vote. Well, of course, no one else could do it because only men could be elected to the legislature. But after those first two gifts, women tirelessly lobbied for suffrage bills, saw them defeated, then tried again. By the 1890s, suffragists had won in the progressive states of Colorado and Idaho. So suddenly the West was not just a national but a global epicenter of suffrage. The only competition was really the other settler societies of Australia and New Zealand.
Winifred Gallagher is our guest. The book is New Women in the Old West, From Settlers to Suffragists, An Untold American Story. To give folks an idea of the type of obstacles these women were facing, the story of Abigail Scott Dunaway sort of jumps off the page at me. This illustrates that in that day, women's rights were so restricted that their husband had complete control of the family finances and, in fact, in a legal sense, could sign away a home and really put the family in danger and in the poorhouse, and the women had no say in it, no property rights at all.
That's exactly right. Women's position in American society outside the West and for a while even in the West was just terrible. Women's place was only in the home. They were second-class citizens. They had very few legal rights or economic opportunities. Harriet Beecher Stowe, the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, said that a wife was very much like an enslaved person in terms of rights. They had no official role in civic life, much less voting. For respectable women, marriage was the only career that was allowed. And once married, as you pointed out, wives could not own property, divorce, or have custody of their own children. They were considered inferior to men except in virtuousness. So they were given a certain moral authority over matters of right and wrong. And that was really their only form of power. They were really in a very rough place. And Abigail Dunaway, who I call the mother of Western suffrage, experienced this firsthand. She was an Oregon woman. Her parents migrated there, set up a homestead. She married, and as a teenager, she married a homesteader. They developed one homestead and then moved on to another farm. And her husband, and she worked like a dog throughout this entire period, making butter and bread and selling things and farming and bearing 5 or 6 children. One day her husband countersigned a note to a friend to back up a friend's mortgage or something, and the friend defaulted on the note, and Abigail lost her family's home because she had no say. She could do nothing to prevent her husband from signing this document. She was so outraged by that she decided that her real goal was not originally the vote. It was getting married women property rights. And she campaigned for that and then gradually, became more focused on the vote. But she was, talk about hardship, not only after her husband lost the farm, he was kicked by a horse or something and was permanently disabled in some accident. So she had to support the entire family. She did that for a while as a school teacher, and then they moved to Portland, and she opened a millinery shop, which was one of the few businesses that women were allowed to run. And there it was really talking to women coming in to, buy dress patterns and get new hats and talking about their private lives, that she began to realize that hers was not some isolated case. There was this systematic oppression of women who could just be robbed of everything they owned because a husband got drunk or made a foolish business decision. And that really set her on. Before long, she was putting out a women's newspaper and lobbying Congress for women's rights.
It is an amazing story, one of many that you tell us in your book of these women of the West. Probably, and we only have a moment or two left with Winifred Gallagher this morning, probably the most famous of the women of the West was Annie Oakley. And as a novelty, that's probably the way that she is most remembered. However, she had a very, very important role to play in really opening up women to the real possibilities of applying yourself and your skills and really the potential for women in business all across the West and probably help so many people realize that out West is where it's happening.
Yeah, she actually never lived in the West. She was from Ohio and is buried in Ohio, but she was a phenomenal athlete. And you have to put her in the context. This is a time when women were walking around these corsets and these big, heavy, long skirts that were dragging in the dust and making them trip and fall. And it was just a very uncomfortable time to be a woman. Annie would come riding into the arena on side saddle on her horse, jump off the horse, and do a couple of cartwheels, and then start shooting. She could shoot a dime out of the air. She could shoot the ashes off her husband's cigar. She was just a phenomenal athlete with this amazing eye-hand coordination. And she was also, as you say, a very sage businesswoman. She presented herself because she didn't want to appear to be, some sort of radical who could put off a lot of people in her huge audiences, both here and in Europe. So she actually, after doing these astounding feats in the ring, she would entertain journalists and important visitors in her tent by serving tea. She was very, very careful about how she presented herself. She never said she was a suffragist, but she said that women should have equal pay for equal work, that women should serve in the military. And interestingly, Buffalo Bill Cody, who was her employer, who she was a star in his Wild West show, he was kind of a surprising feminist because he insisted on paying his women performers the same as he paid his men, which was unusual at the time, for sure.
Really, really was. And again, we hear that story and so many more in the book New Women in the Old West, From Settlers to Suffragists, an Untold American Story. Winifred Gallagher has been our guest this morning. Winifred, where are we going to learn more about the book and about you?
Well, you could try WinifredGallagher.com, my website, or just Google my name, and a lot of stuff will come up, probably more than you want to know.
It's a Penguin book, and it's